Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Duesterberg, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a member of the advisory committee for the Manufacturing Policy Initiative, which is housed at the O'Neill School of Public Affairs at Indiana University. This is Manufacturing Week nationally, and this is the first of a four-part program on strengthening U.S. manufacturing. The programs will culminate on Friday, October 2nd, with a moderated discussion between representatives of the Trump campaign, which is Senator Mike Brown from Indiana, and Representative Tim Ryan, who is the co-chair of the House Manufacturing Caucus, and speaking in support of the Biden program. The first three programs are supported by background papers commissioned by the Manufacturing Policy Initiative and available on the Manufacturing Policy Initiative website at Indiana University. Hudson Institute has worked over time with MPI, and we are hosting the first three of the sessions. Indiana University will host the fourth session. You will find a link to the fourth session in the emails announcing the first three programs. Today's panel treats the subject of restoring the industrial commons. The second program is on promoting innovation, and the third program to air on Thursday is developing paths to a more resilient manufacturing sector. Today, we have a distinguished panel of experts. Each expert will give opening remarks followed by a discussion, which I will moderate. Leading off our discussion today is Dr. Sridhar Kota, who's the Herrick Professor of Engineering at the University of Michigan and founding executive director of M-Foresight, Alliance for Manufacturing Foresight. He and his colleague at M-Foresight, Tom Maloney, are the authors of the background paper for today's session. Loss of industrial commons is an existential threat to U.S. prosperity. From 2009 to 2012, Sridhar was Assistant Director for Advanced Manufacturing at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Next, we are honored to have Bill Osborne, who is Senior Vice President of Enterprise Operations at the Boeing Company. The enterprise operations functions includes oversight of supply chain, manufacturing, and quality, a huge responsibility. This is for the world's leading edge aerospace company. Bill previously had leading positions in supply chain and manufacturing at Ford Motor Company, Navistar, and Federal Signal. Next, we will hear from Sue Smith, the Vice President for Technology and Applied Sciences Division and the Corporate Executive for Advanced Manufacturing at Ivy Tech Community Colleges, which serves nearly 100,000 students in the state of Indiana in between 40 and 50 regional campuses and education centers. Sue is very active at Ivy Tech in developing innovative apprenticeship programs and specialized skills training for manufacturing, works in close contact with industrial companies, not only in Indiana, but around the country. Finally, Zuul Khan is Senior Supply Chain Manager for Sukiya Group North America and Tassus Corporation, which manufactures key automotive components for all major Japanese automakers in North America and for General Motors at its three plants in Indiana, Alabama, and Texas. So, Sridhar, you want to lead off the discussion? Over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Tom. Thanks for allowing me to share my thoughts. First of all, let me acknowledge my co-author, Tom Mahoney, for all his work in preparing our paper. Let me start with a simple example. Back in 2018, M-Foresight conducted a series of roundtable discussions around the nation in various cities with leaders in manufacturing and researchers and investors and economists. And in our Austin roundtable, we learned that nanoelectronics technology developed by UT Austin researchers going back to the late 90s, is now being scaled, manufactured in Japan by Canon. So we asked the researchers and the representatives from Canon who are at the table why they don't manufacture it here in the US. They explain in great detail how we lack the manufacturing know-how, precision machinery, and engineering skills needed to scale that emerging technology. So just a note, researchers at UT Austin were initially funded by federally funded National Science Foundation, basic research, and later on by NIST ATP program back in the late 90s to develop the technology. So when they finally demonstrated the potential for this technology, the federal funding dried out. And our US companies showed very little interest or no interest at all. Canon saw the long-term potential, and they took the risk and they invested $10 million later in this nascent technology. So this story reveals how we are creating knowledge, but not national wealth. We are inventing, but we are not doing the innovation and manufacturing. So the federal government investing in basic research and sometimes in translational research, like in SBIR programs, ARPA or DARPA, that's all good, but not sufficient because we leave everything else to the magic hand of free market, and that has not worked in decades. So this is a fallacy of our knowledge economy. Number two, US multinational companies are generally focused on short-term quarterly profits, and they'll continue to offshore if it yields short-term gains. And it actually does. That's the reason why we need government, which has a critical role to play in fixing this market failure. So we may be the most inventive country in the world, but no longer the most innovative, at least in hardware. Because technological innovation is really about making products or new products, new processes at scale by leveraging our discoveries and inventions. So that's the innovation, different from invention. So decades of offshore manufacturing have eroded our industrial commons. That is, industrial commons meaning the engineering skills, manufacturing know-how, and supply chains. It diminished our capacity to innovate because we eroded this. And because of the tight linkage between manufacturing and new product innovation is lost, so the long-held strategy of invent here, manufacture there is fast becoming invent there, manufacture there, or innovate there and manufacture there. By the way, this is also true with many other examples, including they studied 150 hardware startups from MIT last decade. And none of those startups scaled in this country. Of those that scaled, 70% of them scaled in China. So this is not about reshoring lost industries. We need to restore our industrial commons to rebuild our lost capabilities so we can establish and lead the hardware industries of the future. For that to happen, we need a national strategy, and we need sustained investment in engineering and manufacturing innovation ecosystem, because investments in basic science and research are essential, but not sufficient. See, other countries like Japan, South Korea, Germany, they invest 4 to 8 times as much as we do in translational R&D, that is engineering and manufacturing R&D. So we need a bold industrial policy if we are serious about this. But somehow that has been a dreaded word for decades. But I must remind everyone that we already have an industrial policy in certain sectors, like, including aerospace industry, and it is working. So we need similar policies in other sectors, like electric vehicles, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, battery storage, Industry 4.0, and in foundational capabilities like machine tools. Now, this list is going to be different 5-10 years from now, of course. But we need that foundational infrastructure and a focal point in the government. And right now we have 50 different small manufacturing programs spread over a dozen agencies, and they're not coordinated, somehow giving an impression that we already addressed this challenge, and that's not true. So we really need a focal point for rebuilding our industrial commons. But the good news is there has been really some very important good movement in the Congress lately. There have been a number of bills from both sides to strengthen our manufacturing sectors, which is quite encouraging. I just want to comment on one of them. There's a bipartisan bicameral bill called the Endless Frontiers Act. That is an impressive piece of legislation. Someday when it's passed and implemented, I think it will have salutary impacts on US technology development and commercialization and our long-term competition with China. For instance, it proposes a technology directorate to be added to the National Science Foundation. It proposes regional technology hubs, test beds, university technology centers to advance translational R&D. There are other provisions in the bill to support workforce development, particularly small and medium-sized manufacturers, because they are the backbone for our manufacturing sector. And we need to provide them with loans and other assistance to upgrade their equipment to Industry 4.0 and strengthen our domestic supply chains. So, and also the level of funding is like $100 billion. I mean, that's a lot more than what we call for, but it's certainly commensurate with the ambitions defined in the bill. It's a great beginning, but I just want to point out two issues with that bill that we still need to fix. One is, we need protections to ensure that new technologies developed with government funding, with taxpayer dollars, must be manufactured in the US. That's the only way to ensure that we get a return on investment by taxpayers. Number two, this technology directorate idea, putting it in an existing agency, I don't think it's a good idea, because all the existing agencies like NSF and NIST and others, they all have well-established cultures and procedures that are honed over many years to meet their respective missions. They do not have, understandably, the focus or the DNA required to achieve the full objectives of this bill. So we need a new agency. Maybe the new technology directorate could be a stepping stone towards establishing a new agency, because it could take some time. And anyhow, so these are all positive developments, and we still have a lot of work to do and actually implement these. There are other bills like the CHIPS Act, which is great for boosting our semiconductor manufacturing. And finally, one more thing I want to say on the green manufacturing, there's been a lot of discussion. Now, I would like to say that regardless of our political beliefs on whether humans caused climate change or not, we must embrace the clean energy technologies because there is a significant global market for it. There is a strong economic argument to be made, and the market for global energy production is shifting towards renewables. And finally, we have two Sputnik moments. We have China 2025, and we have COVID-19. So it's time to act. We have to establish a national strategy that transcends our election cycles to restore our industrial commons, so we can establish and lead the manufacturing industries of the future. So what's invented here, like in Austin, it can actually be manufactured here. To me, that is a clear path to creating wealth, to creating national wealth, to ensure national security, and yes, health security.
Okay, thanks, Sridhar. Over to you, Bill. You've been at the forefront of globalization, global manufacturing production, some of the nation's largest and most successful companies. We look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Tom. And I must say, it's quite an honor to be on the panel today to share some of the concerns that we have in industry about U.S. manufacturing competitiveness. There's no doubt that U.S. manufacturing prowess has waned over the course of the last 50 years. And as Dr. Koda has pointed out in his paper, this has serious implications for U.S. national security policy. Furthermore, the loss of these manufacturing jobs in the United States has further exacerbated the problem of income inequality, which we all know is at the root of much of the political instability that exists in our country today. And yet, while these trends are undeniable, I believe they are shaped by structural forces that are more far-reaching and durable than any industrial policy can fully address. In other words, While I agree with the diagnosis in Dr. Kota's paper, I can't say that I fully agree with the prescription. Now, perhaps what I can say is that industrial policy is likely only a partial solution to what ails U.S. manufacturing. At the heart of the problem, I believe, is U.S. competitiveness. So let me start by saying that the outsourcing trend that we've seen over these last 50 years was accelerated by the liberalization of global trade and the deregulation of financial markets. The free flow of capital across borders ushered in the rise of the large multinational corporation and opened up U.S. manufacturing to stiff competition from all over the globe. Now, while many consider the outsourcing trend to be the result of unfair trade practices or substandard third world wages, I would submit to you that even if that's true, that these are just the brutal forces of market competition at work, and that there really is no escaping them. As an example, just look at Japan, who has had an industrial policy apparatus in place for decades. Japanese labor productivity has stagnated for the last 2 decades. Japanese labor productivity ranks last amongst all G7 nations and 12th amongst OECD nations. And even though this is true, even though there's no significant difference in the capital coefficient amongst all these economies. Now, I don't see this trend toward open markets being stemmed by any form of economic nationalism, nor do I see industrial policy as an adequate shield against them. I would say industrial policy is a necessary but insufficient response to global competition. Therefore, in my view, what's needed to revive U.S. manufacturing is investments in U.S. competitiveness. For example, the U.S. is the only industrialized nation that relies upon private employers to fund its healthcare system. Is this because private employers are particularly efficient in the delivery of healthcare services? No, not at all. Our system is an artifact of World War II, when wage and price controls were imposed and businesses began to offer fringe benefits to compete in a tight labor market. Now, I'm not here to advocate for nationalized healthcare, but what I can tell you is that U.S. manufacturing businesses carry this additional burden into the global markets in which they seek to compete. Another area where U.S. competitiveness needs to be enhanced is human capital. Manufacturing today is not the low-skilled, mind-numbing work that we came to associate it with Rust Belt industries in the past. Taylorism is dead. While many are clamoring for jobs in the high-tech industries like software, the truth is today every industry is high-tech. No industry has been untouched by the technology revolution. So today's factory workers need technical and vocational skills that go far beyond what could be conferred by a high school diploma. To build a digital workforce that industry needs, the United States needs to invest more heavily in technical training at the high school and vocational school level. Many industrial companies are themselves trying to fill this gap because the public education system is not producing graduates with the skills to work in today's digital factories at a rate that's needed to meet the growing demand. And in this way, U.S. education policy is inextricably linked to U.S. industrial policy. And finally, I agree with Dr. Kota because another avenue for enhancing U.S. competitiveness in manufacturing is to provide access to low-cost sources of capital, especially to small-scale and mid-sized privately held manufacturing firms. These are the firms that are most likely to be targeting growth within the U.S., are most likely to adhere to the social contract, and access to low-cost debt will allow them to fund longer-term investments in their core capabilities. And this would also shield them from the quarterly pressures of publicly held firms. Now, this form of support could be in the form of loan guarantees or government-backed insurance to lower the risk for financial institutions to fund this revival of manufacturing. And let me conclude by saying that, yes, U.S. manufacturing has been in a state of decline. And yes, this is a problem for all of us, not just for manufacturers. And while I agree that a highly coordinated industrial policy at the federal level would be helpful, I believe that the policy has to also focus on making U.S. industry more competitive in the labor and capital markets to be successful.
Okay, Bill, that was a great overview and a good segue to our next two speakers. Sue, we're going to turn it over to you. You've been at it at Ivy Tech, one of the nation's leading community colleges in terms of skilled training. And you may have some comments on apprenticeships, which Bill at Boeing will appreciate because Boeing has been a leader in developing skills training up in the Pacific Northwest and other places where they are producing. So Sue, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. And it is a great honor to be on such a distinguished panel. And I appreciate all the comments that have been made. I have a sort of down in the trenches perspective, you might say, from the workforce side of things. And so for us at the community college level, we have a unique set of challenges. And I think the high schools and career tech eds are in the same boat, really. So as manufacturing became increasingly devalued in the past 5 decades, and we all know that that's happened, but the workforce was also devalued. So that workforce that supported manufacturing was also devalued. And so society no longer really saw this sector as a viable career pathway or a bright future. It's not for my children, right? Not for my grandchildren, but for somebody else's, right? But not for mine. So there was that devaluing, and the cost strategy of offshoring continued. Talent began to be directed, as we know, to other sectors. So Bill mentioned the IT sector. So I still hear, folks say, counselors say, don't go to this manufacturing sector, go to IT. Well, IT is manufacturing. I mean, and manufacturing is IT. So we've got a lot of overlap now. So there's a real need to take a hard look at the value proposition for manufacturing careers. And so as we recognize the loss of the industrial commons as a threat to the US on so many levels, it's a start to restoring the innovation that we need to support the resurgence of manufacturing in this country. And I heard Bill mention innovation, and we don't have the right workforce. No, we don't. But training, recruiting, reskilling, and retaining the talent needed was challenging pre-COVID. And if anything, post-COVID, the skills gap has grown even wider. I mean, the surveys that we're seeing in my school are that 55% of manufacturing companies are investing even more in automation and smart factory technology than ever before. And so that's a cause of concern for us because, first of all, we're struggling to recruit students into that field. And secondly, we're struggling to keep up with technology. So, and that leads me to another casualty of devaluing of manufacturing, and that's apprenticeship. And while this practice of investing in employees to get them to a mastery level of a skill, a trade, or an occupation sort of fell out of fashion for many US manufacturing companies, manufacturers in Germany and Switzerland and the UK continued to practice, and they retained this practice, and they retained their manufacturing base. Now China, and I work with Chinese colleges a lot, and China has copied that model from Europe, and they're using it to strengthen manufacturing there even further. So many states in the US now are adopting the model, but changing the perception of manufacturing that has been devalued by society for so many years is going to be difficult. An apprenticeship is a good place to start. It's a system that provided a talented workforce for manufacturing in the US in the past, and we can reuse it to restore the workforce for the future, but it's going to take some support. And apprenticeship programs can support new technologies and the increased skills that are warranted. The new collar careers that we all talk about, they're going to require a combination, as Bill and others have said, of engineering, design, systems thinking, innovation, ideation. Now, all of those things are going to be in the new collar workers, all of those skills. So employers and potential employers are not the only entities who need to prepare for the future of manufacturing and the workforce needs. As Bill said, we've got education that needs to be prepared for the future of manufacturing and the needs in the workforce. Community colleges, high schools, career centers, and universities have to embrace the high-tech apprenticeship programs that are needed. And so education needs to be more closely aligned with industry now more than ever before, because the skills gap, as I said, is widened. Even post-COVID, it will be wider. So apprenticeship is a model that supports education, or that supports industry and education being engaged to develop the workforce. And I think that is the critical component. That's the critical component over the years. And I think Bill and others who have the apprenticeship programs would agree. It takes both the company and the educator or the educating entity to come together to support the development of the workforce. And we need programs for new technologies, like apprenticeships in 5G equipment production and installation, or production and assembly of electric vehicles using new technologies like 3D printing and others. And so all high-tech careers in Industry 4.0, which is rapidly, by the way, becoming Infinity 0.0, and this initiative is ushering in jobs that may not even exist. I have students entering today that will not graduate for 2 years. And so 2 years from now, the environment will look very different maybe than it does now. So there'll be jobs that aren't even in existence right now. So this integrated production, this is a good way to prepare. It's proven, tried and true, apprenticeship is, to develop the new collar workforce. And that new collar workforce will be designers and operators of integrated production systems and a digital supply chain. So to fully develop and implement the system to support an even more technical workforce, all the players must be incentivized. And I think that's been what's been missing so far is, we have employers incentivized by increased productivity, and we have, colleges being incentivized by enrollment and, what students are interested in. Students are interested in CSI and criminal justice and, NCIS and all those things. And so what we need to figure out is how everyone can be incentivized to support this new, this resurgence of manufacturing. And so we need the industrial commons, but without a workforce, we just can't support it. And we've seen that over the last 3 or 4 years. So incentivizing these partnerships between industry and education, which are created through apprenticeship, demonstrates the value of high-tech careers in manufacturing. And so a strategy or agency, including support of education with funds for equipment that at state-of-the-art Industry 4.0 level, and faculty at that state-of-the-art Industry 4.0 level, that and ensuring manufacturing careers grow as high wage, high demand, those things will support the creation of a workforce of experts and an industrial base to rival all nations.
Okay, Sue, thank you very much for that overview, and we'll return to some more specific questions. But let's complete the opening remarks with Zuul, whose company is a smaller or medium-sized enterprise. The previous speakers have referred to some issues for SMEs. So Zuul, we look forward to your perspective.
Sure. Well, first, I'd just like to say thank you for having me. I appreciate being on this panel and in this discussion with everyone. Like you said, coming from a small to mid-sized manufacturer, thinking about our perspective, the first thing that comes to mind for sustainable long-term growth in manufacturing, it's really building that stronger pipeline of talent, the skilled labor to fill the many technical roles in manufacturing. These roles are really critical to our success, and they're increasingly difficult to fill. So, this has definitely been a discussion for a long time, for as long as I can remember. but we still haven't seen the progress that we need there. And so continuing to expand our investment in that in a more coordinated effort, as has already been mentioned, is really key for us. I think about back shortly after the Great Recession, and the lingering unemployment rates were there, still significantly higher than where we ultimately got to, but yet manufacturing companies still were struggling to fill key technical roles. So now we think about today, as we're coming through this pandemic, and there's still so many that are unemployed, but yet still we're talking about manufacturers unable to find the trained staff to fill those roles. So we have to do more to advance those efforts, to get more apprenticeship programs in place, and to incentivize both individuals as well as the companies to pursue those career paths, as has already been mentioned. Without that talent base, it's really difficult for us to continue to grow and expand the domestic manufacturing, because we just don't have the staff and the talent there to support that growth. The next thing that came to mind for me, and I know this is a topic we'll talk about more later, is really MEP programs. So as a smaller business, we lean on those quite a lot. Those programs are critical to our success and our ability to tap into resources that we may not have internally. We don't necessarily have specialists in every field. And, I can speak from experience that a lot of us in small businesses have to wear a lot of different hats. We, often refer to it as being an expert generalist, where we're strong in a number of areas, but we may not have a specialization in all of those different areas in-house. And so, we turn to MEPs to help us tackle and navigate through complex problems that really require that specialty and really call for an expert in that particular topic. And small businesses just can't support having that staff and those experts in-house all the time. And so continuing to expand and create easy access to those for small businesses all across the country is really going to be key to our ability to continue to improve our operations, continue to compete globally, and bring more manufacturing back. I think we've already talked a little bit about how we can't necessarily bring back everything that's already been lost, but as we're looking forward, being at the forefront of the next wave and the next generation of manufacturing is really the great challenge that we have today. And without providing businesses those resources to be able to tackle those complex challenges, and without having the talent base there to be able to employ throughout all of our business, makes it really difficult to be able to successfully do that, and to successfully bring so much more manufacturing back to the U.S. The last thing that really came to mind for me as I was thinking through this, and it's a little different, I think, than what some of the other comments have been, is just to have stability. For the small businesses, having stability in our policy, it's really key. If I think about some of the USTR 301 tariffs and the speed in which those were rolled out and implemented, it was a major challenge for us as a smaller business to navigate that, and it strained our resources. And so, dealing with change is always tough, and we're already fighting the battle to have all the talent that we need and deal with the constantly changing environment. So any additional instability only pulls from our resources even further. And so having stability allows us to focus in the areas we need to be focused on, which is improving our operations, advancing our technologies, and really driving competition globally so that we are at the forefront. So for me, I would just like to see greater emphasis on expanding and really incentivizing those programs, as well as creating more stability for us as a small business so that we can dedicate the resources we have to our operations and to growing our business.
Okay, Zuul, thank you very much for those insights. I wonder if you could just explain to our audience who may not know what MEPs are, manufacturing extension partnerships, but could you just explain what those do and how you guys have used them?
Yeah, so for us, it's a lot like a consultant, right? So there are different programs around the country that small businesses can reach out to and work with to deal with specific problems or challenges that we face. And so, for TASIS, we've pulled on the Purdue MEP program a few different times. That has been a great resource for us. As I'd mentioned earlier, it's really, where we don't have necessarily all of those skills or expertise in-house, it allows us to call on them for additional support, additional resources, additional sets of eyes to help us look at different complex problems and figure out the best solution for us moving forward.
Okay, so I should just mention that MEPs are joint efforts by industry, educational establishment, but supported by the federal government through, I believe, NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, which provides some support and organization for those. I'd like to give each of the panelists, if you would like, a chance to comment on what the others have argued. Maybe starting with Sridhar, if you would like to comment on some of the other presentations.
Sure. Thanks again. It's great to be on panel with real experts here. I really appreciate it. Like Mr. Osborne's comments, and industrial policy is necessary, not sufficient. I agree. It's the first step, and of course, you have outlined even bigger challenges going beyond industrial policy. They're addressing the healthcare challenge, that the burden that manufacturers have. Certainly, I completely agree that the education policy, industrial policy, as you noted, are tightly linked. I'm with that. On that, and also with what for challenges SMEs face, and also what Sue pointed out on the apprenticeship programs. I just want to. I completely agree that we need the talent pipeline, and there are other ways to do it. We can probably get into more details about beyond community colleges, and actually having polytechnic universities to create engineering technicians programs. So those can help SMEs as well as inspire our students to go into their field, into manufacturing. So I'll leave it at that. We'll come back to it.
Okay, Bill, let's turn to you if you have any reactions. But I'd like to ask you. I was struck by your remarks about the role of manufacturing employment, skills training, playing a role in income inequality, and also the comments of you and others on the inability to attract, or the difficulties of attracting a broad variety of students to manufacturing occupations, both skilled production work, but also some of the STEM fields as well. This is especially true for women and minorities, I think. So could you maybe react to others, but also comment on sort of the cultural issues that we have in attracting students to the manufacturing sector?
Yeah, I just think there's a misconception that manufacturing as a sector has, one, very few growth prospects, and two, is not sexy. But as I said before, if you walk into a modern manufacturing facility, you'll find just as much technology in plants as you find in some other sectors of the economy. As a matter of fact, if you look at, traditional industries like automotives, for example, the vast majority of investment that has gone into the automotive industry over the last 30 to 40 years has been in electronics, because the fundamental content of vehicles is now more electronics based than anything else. And then when you look at modern factories, the amount of automation, the amount of artificial intelligence and smart devices, really every industry is high tech now. And so what we got to do, I think, is make sure that young engineers and young technical people see a path for growth in the manufacturing sector, because it is high tech. And you know, my earlier comment about income inequality is, you know, the manufacturing sector has historically been responsible for the development of the middle class in this country. And a solid and stable middle class is fundamental to a stable economy. And I would tell you that I believe that income inequality in the US is a fundamental reason why we have seen so much political instability. It's the erosion of the middle class. Without a strong manufacturing sector, I fear it's very difficult to build and have a strong political system that's stable. You can only accomplish that by having a sector that generates the kinds of, you know, decent paying jobs that working people depend on. We can't all find that kind of make that kind of living in a lot of these service sectors. So to me, you know, there's a strong link between a healthy manufacturing base and a stable political system.
Okay, thanks. Sue, any reactions to the others? And also perhaps you could drill down a little bit on your call for more federal and state support for apprenticeship systems, but also for building collaboration with industry and finding the equipment to train people on.
Sure. Yeah, I often joke only half-heartedly that what manufacturing really needs is a reality show. And so that everyone in America can see what actually goes on in a modern manufacturing plant, as Bill has said, in a true integrated production system as part of a digital supply chain. And you know, when we recruit students into manufacturing, when we try to recruit students really into any sector, we're recruiting them using faculty and staff who are academics, right? So we're doing that at the high school level, we're doing that, you know, at the college level. So the advisors are academics that are trying to help students know where to go. And so the awareness of how high-tech manufacturing is and what opportunities are available to go even beyond middle class in manufacturing is it's just not widely known. And so I think that what's helpful is having those robust partnerships with manufacturing companies, apprenticeships that folks can really get behind and see apprenticeships. You know, I see apprenticeship as a PhD in some sort of subject or some skill or some craft. I mean, you would want, just as you would want a doctor, you know, to support your health care, you would want an electrician to support the electrical function in your home, right? So I mean, it's that mastery. And I think if we can raise that awareness as to the level of expertise that really signifies, I think we could get at those high level jobs. You know, I think we could get at those high tech jobs that so many companies are asking for. But I think it really does take those robust partnerships with employers to make that connection so that the workforce can see, or the potential employees and potential students can see the clear pathway, really. How do I get from, you know, lower to middle class? How do I get, you know, from, you know, this health or this, you know, job as a waitress over to the middle class? And, you know, and I'll give you an example. We had an interesting experience in Indiana where we worked with some vendors, and we did a 10,000 class initiative. So 10,000 students could take class for free, or 10,000 classes for free for a period of time. And so it was interesting that for industry, we had about 1,500 students who signed up for that, and for manufacturing, and it went really well. Students got jobs in Siemens and different companies, but getting them into those, if there were a cost, I don't know if they would have signed up to do that. If it weren't a crisis, I don't know if they would have signed up to do that. So getting that awareness, I think, is critical. And I think getting support for initiatives like that, getting support for equipment so that, when you walk into my lab, it looks just like Boeing, or it looks just like, Cummins, or it looks just like Siemens, so that I can truly get students interested in controlling that whole system with their cell phone, for example. So I think that's really going to be the key in getting support for equipment and faculty that we can afford to train students.
Okay, thanks, Sue. Zuul, Bill gave a couple of ideas about strengthening the ability of SMEs to access capital, financial markets. There's been sort of a long debate in both the academic literature and the public policy literature about whether or not we have made adequate capital available to small and medium enterprises. Could you comment on that? And if you have any other comments on reactions to the other presentations?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a great idea to have more accessible and low-cost funding available for small businesses to, encourage investment in our manufacturing here and in growing that. And when we look at historically when we have recessions, the businesses that come out of it or lead into it in the best financial positions and aren't leveraged too much, they come out of recessions very strong. They're able to minimize layoffs, and they're able to focus on taking advantage of the downturn to better themselves and better position their companies. And so having that funding available for small businesses so that they're not cash strapped and then heading into a recession aren't able to weather that is critical to really having that growth and sustain it over the long term, even through downturns and other tough spells. In addition to that, just listening to everyone else, I think all are making great points. Early in my career, I actually worked in marketing on the supply chain side. And, as a small company, again, we kind of did a lot of different things, but I would say no less than 50% of my time in marketing was focused on recruiting and attracting, employees, raising awareness of exactly what everyone's saying, that manufacturing is not the old dingy manufacturing that so many perceive it to be. It is, a clean, high-tech environment now. And so raising that awareness and encouraging more students to pursue those paths and pursue some of the great career opportunities that are in manufacturing is huge. We also do that internally where, we're trying to sustain our employee base and trying to keep, a positive culture where, in manufacturing, it can be high paced and it can be taxing. And so doing other things to encourage employees and to keep your staff, because it is so difficult to replace them, was always critical for us.
Okay, thanks. I want to change the conversation a little bit. One big challenge for all of U.S. manufacturing, or most of U.S. manufacturing, that we haven't directly focused on is the rise of China as a competitor. And there's been lots of critiques of the tactics and strategies that the Chinese employ. I'd like to just ask the general question of, and I would note too that there's lots of attention among policymakers in pushing back against Chinese practices, which have contributed greatly to the loss of market share of U.S. manufacturing around the world and the gradual erosion of the industrial commons. So the general question is, are we doing the right things at least the national level in dealing with the Chinese challenge? And I have a more specific question that drills down a little bit. One of the problems for certain types of manufacturing that I think all of you will be familiar with is access to raw materials, metals, things like rare earths. And it's become increasingly aware as we globalize supply chains that we're dependent on China for a lot of those raw materials or metals. They control 80% of the rare earths. Magnesium, which is a lighter metal used to improve the performance of autos and all transportation equipment. Chinese have acquired big stakes in that. Battery raw materials for lithium-ion batteries, which are important to aerospace, but also to the electric vehicle industry, to the telecommunications industry, cell phone industry. China has acquired mines around the world for lithium, for cobalt, and graphite. So can you all address the policy response to China and the specific, the reality, perhaps I'm exaggerating, of the problem of access to raw materials? Bill, maybe we go to you first. You've had long experience in all of these things. China is important. Do you have any reactions?
Well, you know, clearly the Chinese are making investments both in, you know, acquiring scarce resources around the world and investing in relationships in the jurisdictions that, you know, that have those resources. The Chinese have been making massive investments, for example, in Africa. Both, you know, not just in acquiring the resources, but also investing in public infrastructure in order to build relationships with those countries, and providing capital and loans to those countries. And this is part of a long-term strategy that the Chinese have in their China 2025 effort to grow the Chinese economy. And you know, I can't comment on what their aims are with this, but clearly they believe their future to sustain the Chinese economy is massive growth and massive industrialization. So in the areas of manufacturing and construction, they are not only acquiring the resources, but they're acquiring the expertise. And I view this, I view the United States as sort of being asleep at the wheel, you know, with respect to this as a potential threat. And so we have to, you know, we have to amp up our investments and compete with the Chinese on a global scale for these factors of production, and also to invest in these relationships around the world. You know, Africa controls a huge percentage of the world's precious metals, without which we can't make some of the things that we need to make in advanced electronics. So I would say that, you know, we are behind, and we have to catch up. We have to be able to compete around the world for these factors of production.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Sridhar, do you have any comments?
And Bill said it quite well. So, yeah, your question was, what are we doing? Are we doing enough? I don't think we are doing anything. We've been talking about this for decades. Even if you take the rare earth example, China's, first of all, they've been making long-term investments. They have a strategy. We only heard of 2025. We don't know what's in 2035 and 2045. They're already working on it. Whereas we can't get past whatever, November elections, no matter when we talk to Washington, D.C. So the rare earths, they made a strategic investment back in the early 90s to acquire these mines. We started discussing rare earths 20 years later, but it was already too late. So we don't know what else we are already late on, because we are still having these reports after reports and discussing. So this is why we need a strategy, first of all, going beyond industrial policy, and we need to identify critical sectors and double down. We talk about Chinese intellectual property theft, and that may be a real issue, no question about it. That probably is. But we are willingly giving away our IP every day. I give Texas Austin one example. There are hundreds of examples like that as we speak right now. So I think that's all it goes back to us actually, it's time to act. It's time to have a strategy. It's time to make long-term investments. And that's what the government has to do. The private sector, there's not much we can do. Really the easiest thing to do is to, come up with an idea and send it to China, get it made there, because there's a one-stop shop. That's an easy decision. It's not the labor at all. Labor is a small fraction. It's the supply chains, the know-how they have, the manufacturing know-how, what we used to call American ingenuity 70 years ago. That's what they have already. So that's what we need to rebuild.
Okay, Zuul, from your perspective, you mentioned trade in your opening remarks as being somewhat of an issue. Have you had problems getting access to the needed raw materials that you use in supplying the auto industry?
I wouldn't say we've had trouble getting access. I mean, currently with coming out of COVID and whatnot, there's been plenty of supply chain disruptions. Logistics are a nightmare right now. So getting product in that sense physically out of China has been a challenge. Getting access to the components that we need in general, it certainly hasn't been. Dealing with the changes in tariffs, that impacted us significantly as a small business. In automotive, it's not easy to change suppliers. There's a lengthy process we go through. And the sudden implementation of those type tariffs, that really impacted us. It's not something we could respond to quickly. We had to ultimately absorb, and so that puts a major strain on us as a business, and particularly heading into what was in a prolonged shutdown period. That was a major cash constraint for us that could have been better utilized during that shutdown period. And thinking about China, I really agree with what everyone's saying. We can't necessarily look at everything that's already went there and try to pull it all back. It's really looking forward, looking at the long term and what should we be investing in now to set us up in the future to really be at the forefront.
Okay, we're coming towards the end of our time. I had another question related to federal policy. Lots of voices are calling for the return of manufacturing to the United States. You all have commented on the need to, build competitiveness, but there are now, partly in the wake of the shortages we saw during the pandemic, there are louder calls for returning production. So the United States is considering, certain incentives for companies to come back. The Japanese have a modest but meaningful $2 billion incentive program to bring production back to Japan. The Europeans are considering all kinds of different ways to support national champions and induce companies to return production. Do you all think that this is a good idea? And if so, what are the most effective tools to incentivize American companies and help American companies move some production at least back into the United States? Does anybody want to tackle that one?
Yeah, that's a tough one, Tom, because it depends on the scale that you're talking about. If you're trying to drive millions of jobs back to the United States, I'm not sure there's an effective incentive for that. If, on the other hand, what you're trying to do is target specific industries or subsectors where there are strategic implications to controlling the supply chain or controlling the means of production, I think that's a more manageable task. And I think those things can be done on a scale that focuses on intellectual property, that focuses on tax credits for investments. Those are things that can be quite effective on a small scale. You know, if you notice, a lot of defense contractors, you know, have almost all their production in the United States for strategic reasons and strategic purposes. So I think it's a question about scale. So, you know, if we have this industrial policy, which, you know, by the way, I do support, I think it is a necessary condition. You got to focus really on strategic sectors that make sense, you know, and it could be, you know, semiconductor production. You know, there could be a handful of key industries. Those things I think can be effectively targeted. If the goal is to to try to rebuild the American middle class, that's a much bigger task. And I think, you know, some of the policy prescriptions there, it would have to be pretty broad, and, you know, to make U.S. manufacturing competitive on a broad basis. But things like tax credits and protection for intellectual property developed in the United States, those things could be very effective for strategic industries.
Okay, anybody else want to weigh in on that subject?
I could just to add to what Bill said so well already. I think at the end of the day, building that American middle class is fundamental. And we'll start somewhere, starting with the intellectual property. American taxpayers are the ones who are funding all the R&D, federal R&D. And one of the proposals is to make sure what's invented here is manufactured here, period. And certainly the tax incentives can help, but there is more strategically on certain sectors, even if you take semiconductor industry, for example, semiconductor packaging, I know what they're doing on the CHIPS Act is very good, but semiconductor packaging that all went to Hong Kong and Macau in the late 60s and 70s because it was all late 70s because it was assembly labor intensive. Mm-hmm. All those operations are fully automated now over there. There's no reason why we can't bring them back here to whether it is Oregon or Arizona. So when you bring those, that's how you build supply chains around that in the longer term. But we do need to have a strategy, identify critical sectors and double down, not only in the short term, but also play the long-term game that China and other countries seem to be doing it really well.
Okay, excellent. Sue or Zuul, any final comments?
You know, I think just kind of reiterating what the others have already said, you know, when we're facing such a large challenge like that, a large problem, the best way to tackle it is to break it down into smaller segments and tackle it one piece at a time. You know, it's too much to try to tackle all at once, all in one broad swoop. So, you know, breaking it down and really tackling it at each level is really going to be the key.
Okay. Sue, any final comments from you?
You know, I would just add that with all the strategy, you can't forget that, you know, before COVID, we had millions of jobs going unfilled. And, you know, we still have that situation. And so as we tackle this problem, I can agree, one little bit at a time, let's remember the workforce has to be in place in order to make anything successful that we try to bring back or that we try to grow.
Okay, I want to thank all of you for a comprehensive and excellent discussion. I think we surfaced a lot of issues and some constructive ideas about how to address them. So thank you all for taking the time to be with us. Let me just remind our viewers that the program tomorrow will focus more succinctly on innovation and policies to incentivize innovation. So with that, let me thank you all again for both our audience and our panelists, and I hope this moved the ball forward in our thinking about strengthening U.S. manufacturing.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.